The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic for what seemed like the 100th time that day. 23 years of service in the Queen's Guard had taught him that perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor sharp, and his bearskin hat sat at the precise angle drilled into him during countless hours of training. James had joined the Grenadier Guards as a young man of 18, full of pride and determination to serve his country. Over the decades, he had stood motionless through torrential rain, blazing heat, and bitter cold. He had maintained his composure while tourists shouted, waved, and occasionally tried to make him laugh or break his stoic expression. The rules were simple and absolute. Remain silent, stay still, and never break character while on duty. The palace grounds were already bustling with the first wave of tourists, their cameras clicking as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous guards. James took his position at his post, his polished boots clicking against the stone. His rifle was held at the regulation angle, his eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing at all. As the crowd gathered, James noticed the usual mix of visitors. Families with excited children pointing and whispering, elderly couples moving slowly with walking sticks, teenagers taking selfies, and tour groups following guides who spoke in various languages. Each day brought hundreds of faces, but James had trained himself to observe without engaging, to be aware without acknowledgement. The protocols were clear and had been reinforced through years of training and tradition. Guards were living symbols of British heritage and discipline. They represented centuries of military excellence and unwavering dedication to duty. Breaking protocol was not just a personal failing. It was seen as a betrayal of the institution itself. James had seen colleagues reprimanded for the smallest infractions, and he had never once considered stepping outside the boundaries of his role. Yet something was different about this particular morning. Perhaps it was the gentle warmth of the spring air, or maybe it was the unusually diverse crowd that had gathered. As James stood at attention, he found his trained eye drawn to certain individuals in the crowd who seemed to be struggling in ways that others were not. His military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and accurately, and he could see that some visitors were facing challenges that went beyond the typical tourist experience. The first hour of his shift passed as usual, with the familiar rhythm of tourists coming and going, cameras flashing, and the distant sounds of London traffic. James maintained his position perfectly, his breathing controlled, his expression neutral. But deep in his mind, something was stirring. After more than 2 decades of service, he was beginning to question whether rigid adherence to protocol was always the highest form of service. As the morning progressed and the crowd grew larger, James found himself at a crossroads he had never anticipated. The very foundation of his training was being challenged not by external forces, but by something within himself. The guard who had never questioned an order was about to face a situation that would test everything he believed about duty, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve others. The first test of James's resolve came in the form of an elderly woman using a walker, accompanied by what appeared to be her adult daughter. Margaret Henderson, aged 78, had traveled from Scotland with her daughter Sarah to fulfill a lifelong dream of seeing the Queen's Guard up close. Margaret suffered from severe arthritis and had recently been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, making this likely her last opportunity for such a journey. Sarah had planned the trip carefully, choosing a weekday morning when she hoped the crowds might be lighter. She watched her mother struggle with each step, the walker providing necessary but inadequate support on the uneven cobblestones. Margaret's face showed determination mixed with frustration as she tried to position herself for a photograph that would capture both her and one of the famous guards. From his position, James observed the woman's difficulty. His peripheral vision, honed by years of training, allowed him to see Margaret attempting to maneuver closer while maintaining her balance. The crowd, unaware of her struggles, continued to press forward, making her task even more challenging. Several times Margaret nearly lost her footing as younger, more agile tourists moved around her without consideration. James felt an unfamiliar tension building in his chest. The regulations were crystal clear. No interaction with tourists, no acknowledgement of their presence, no deviation from position, except in cases of immediate security threats. Yet watching this elderly woman struggle stirred something in him that went beyond military protocol. His own grandmother had faced similar challenges in her final years, and he remembered the dignity with which she had approached each day despite her limitations. Sarah, growing increasingly concerned for her mother's safety, approached one of the barriers and spoke quietly to a nearby police officer. She explained her mother's condition and asked if there was any way Margaret could have just a moment closer to the guard for a photograph. The officer, bound by his own regulations, explained sympathetically that the barriers were in place for everyone's safety and that no exceptions could be made. Margaret overheard the conversation and felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. She had saved for months to make this trip, and Sarah had taken time off work to accompany her. The simple request for a clearer photograph seemed impossible to fulfill. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped her walker, and she began to turn away, ready to settle for a distant shot that would hardly capture the majesty she had hoped to remember. It was at this moment that James faced his defining choice. Everything in his training screamed against what he was considering. The consequences of breaking protocol could be severe: disciplinary action, demotion, or even dismissal from the service he loved. His spotless record, built over more than 2 decades, could be destroyed in a single moment of compassion. But as James watched Margaret's shoulders slump in defeat, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of service requires stepping beyond the boundaries of conventional duty. The very values that the Guard represented, honor, dignity, and service to others, seemed to demand something more than rigid adherence to rules. In that instant, James made a decision that would change not only his own life, but also touch the hearts of everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold. James Morrison broke protocol for the first time in his 23-year career. Moving with the same precision that had defined his military service, he took 3 measured steps forward and gently extended his white-gloved hand toward Margaret. The crowd fell silent, phones stopped recording, and even the police officers looked on in amazement as the stoic guard offered assistance to the elderly woman. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked up at James, whose face remained professionally neutral, but she could see something warm and human in his eyes. With Sarah's help, Margaret carefully made her way closer to the guard, who positioned himself to ensure she had the perfect angle for her photograph. The crowd, recognizing the significance of the moment, created a respectful circle around them. Sarah fumbled with her camera, her hands shaking with emotion as she captured image after image of her mother standing beside the guard. Margaret, despite her physical limitations, seemed to stand a little taller, her face beaming with joy and pride. James maintained his formal posture throughout, but those observing closely could see the subtle nod of acknowledgement he gave when Margaret whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Word of the guard's compassionate act spread quickly through the crowd. Visitors who had been jostling for position began to notice others who might need assistance. An American family helped an elderly Japanese tourist navigate the cobblestones. A group of teenagers made space for a family with a child in a wheelchair. The atmosphere around the palace had shifted from one of competitive tourist photography to something resembling community and mutual care. Among the crowd was Maria Santos, a young mother from Spain traveling with her 8-year-old son Diego, who had autism. Diego had been overwhelmed by the noise and crowds, and his mother had been considering leaving early to avoid a meltdown. But when Diego saw the guard's kind gesture toward Margaret, something changed in his demeanor. He became fascinated by the guard's uniform and began asking his mother questions about the soldier's role. Maria noticed that Diego was calmer than he had been all morning. Her son, who typically struggled with new environments and social situations, seemed drawn to the order and predictability represented by the guard's presence. She watched as Diego began to mimic the guard's posture, standing straighter and attempting to remain still, like the soldier he was observing. James, still maintaining his post after helping Margaret, became aware of the young boy's attention. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Diego's attempts to stand at attention, the child's serious expression as he tried to copy the guard's bearing. The boy's dedication and innocent admiration reminded James of his own childhood fascination with soldiers and his dreams of military service. The ripple effect of James's initial act of kindness continued to spread. Other tourists began to show more consideration for those around them. Parents pointed out the guards' helpful behavior to their children, using it as a teaching moment about kindness and respect. The morning that had begun with the usual tourist chaos had transformed into something entirely different, and James found himself at the center of a quiet revolution in human decency. But the most significant moment was yet to come. As Diego continued his earnest attempt to stand like a soldier, James realized that his break-in protocol had opened a door to something much larger than a simple photograph with an elderly tourist. Diego's concentration was intense as he tried to replicate James's military bearing. The 8-year-old boy had positioned himself about 10 feet away from the guard, his small frame attempting to mirror the soldier's perfect posture. His autism, which often made social interactions challenging, seemed to work in his favor as he focused completely on the task of standing at attention. Maria watched her son with amazement. Diego rarely showed interest in interacting with strangers, and his ability to focus on activities outside his specific interests was limited. Yet here he was, completely absorbed in copying the guard's movements and stance. She could see that her son was not just mimicking the position, but was genuinely trying to understand the discipline and purpose behind it. James noticed the boy's serious dedication and felt something shift in his understanding of his role. For years he had thought of himself as a symbol, a living piece of British heritage meant to be observed but not to interact. Watching Diego's earnest efforts made him realize that sometimes being a symbol meant actively inspiring others, not just standing as a silent representation of duty and honor. The crowd began to take notice of the young boy's behavior. Several tourists started taking pictures of Diego standing at attention near the guard, charmed by the child's determination and respect. But James could see that the attention was beginning to make Diego uncomfortable. The boy's movements became more rigid, and he began to show signs of the anxiety that often accompanied his autism when he felt overwhelmed. Making his second unprecedented decision of the day, James took another step toward Diego. The crowd held its breath as the guard approached the child with the same measured precision he had shown with Margaret. James knelt down to Diego's eye level, breaking another cardinal rule of Royal Guard protocol, and spoke in a quiet voice that only the boy could hear. "You stand like a true soldier," James whispered to Diego. "But soldiers also know when to rest." He gently guided Diego to a more relaxed position and showed him how to stand with dignity without the rigid formality required of guards on duty. Diego's face lit up with understanding and pride at receiving instruction from a real soldier. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched the interaction. Diego had struggled with social connections his entire life, often feeling misunderstood or different from other children. To see this distinguished guard treat her son with such respect and attention was overwhelming. She approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but wanting to express her gratitude. "Thank you," Maria said quietly to James. "He's never been interested in anything like this before." James nodded respectfully and, still kneeling beside Diego, asked the boy if he would like to learn about the different parts of a guard's uniform. Diego's eyes grew wide with excitement as James pointed out the significance of various elements, from the brass buttons to the ceremonial sword. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, but its impact extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other families with children who had special needs began to approach, having witnessed the guard's patience and understanding. James found himself in the unprecedented position of serving not just as a ceremonial figure, but as an active source of comfort and inspiration for visitors who rarely receive such consideration in tourist settings. A family from Germany approached, with their teenage daughter Anna, who had Down syndrome and had been fascinated by the pageantry of the palace. Following James's example with Diego, he took a moment to acknowledge Anna's excitement and briefly explained the history behind the guard's role. Anna beamed with joy at being treated with such dignity and respect by someone she clearly admired. As word of the guard's compassionate actions spread through social media, the story began to take on a life of its own. Sarah had posted the photographs of her mother Margaret with James, along with a heartfelt caption about the guard's unexpected kindness. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times, with people from around the world commenting on the humanity displayed by the soldier. Maria had also captured video footage of James interacting with Diego, showing the moment when the nun guard knelt down to speak with her son. The video went viral, with autism advocacy groups praising the guard's sensitivity and understanding. Comments poured in from parents of children with special needs, many sharing their own stories of times when small acts of kindness from strangers had made enormous differences in their families' lives. Back at Buckingham Palace, James's commanding officers had become aware of the situation. Colonel William Hartley, who had served alongside James for over a decade, was called in to review the incidents. Traditional military protocol would have demanded immediate disciplinary action for multiple breaches of conduct. The rules existed, for good reasons, including security concerns and the maintenance of the ceremonial dignity that tourists expected to see. However, Colonel Hartley found himself in an unusual position. The public response to James's actions had been overwhelmingly positive, and the story was being covered by major news outlets as an example of British values at their finest. The palace press office was fielding calls from journalists around the world, all wanting to know more about the guard who had shown such compassion to tourists with special needs. More importantly, Colonel Hartley had received calls from the families who had been helped by James. Margaret's daughter Sarah had phoned to express her gratitude, explaining how much the photograph meant to her mother, who was already beginning to forget many recent experiences due to her dementia. Maria had written a detailed letter describing how Diego had talked about nothing but his encounter with the kind soldier for days afterward, showing more social engagement than he had displayed in months. The colonel faced a decision that went beyond simple rule enforcement. James Morrison was an exemplary soldier with an unblemished record who had acted out of genuine compassion. The impact of his actions had been profoundly positive, not just for the individuals he had helped, but for the reputation of the guards and the palace itself. The story was being held up as an example of what British hospitality and decency could look like in practice. When Colonel Hartley called James into his office, the guard expected to face serious consequences for his actions. He was prepared to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate, but he knew he could not regret his choices. Standing at attention before his superior officer, James felt the same sense of rightness about his actions that he had felt in the moment he had first stepped forward to help Margaret. Instead of the reprimand he expected, Colonel Hartley asked James to sit down for an informal conversation. The colonel explained the attention the story had received and the positive impact it was having on public perception of the guards. He also shared some of the messages from families who had been touched by James's kindness, including several from military families who saw his actions as embodying the best traditions of service. The conversation that followed would reshape not only James's understanding of his role, but also influence how the guards approached their interaction with the public. Colonel Hartley revealed that the incident had sparked discussions at the highest levels about whether certain protocols might be adapted to allow for discretionary acts of assistance, particularly for visitors with special needs or disabilities. 6 months after that transformative morning, James Morrison found himself in an entirely new role within the Queen's Guard. Rather than facing disciplinary action, he had been selected to help develop new guidelines for guard interactions with visitors who needed special assistance. The Morrison Protocol, as it came to be known informally among the guards, provided specific circumstances under which guards could break traditional protocol to provide aid to elderly visitors, individuals with disabilities, or families with special needs children. The changes were carefully crafted to maintain the dignity and security requirements of the guard, while allowing for moments of human compassion. Guards received additional training on recognizing when assistance might be needed and how to provide it without compromising their primary duties. The program became a model for other ceremonial units around the world, with military organizations from several countries sending representatives to study the British approach. Margaret Henderson returned to Buckingham Palace 1 year later, this time in a wheelchair but with her memory of that special day still intact. James was on duty again when she arrived, and he was able to greet her properly within the new guidelines. The photograph Sarah took that day showed Margaret holding the picture from her previous visit, creating a touching before and after image that captured both the progression of her condition and the enduring impact of kindness. Diego Santos also returned with his mother Maria, and the boy who had once struggled with social interactions had developed a deep interest in military history and service. He had written letters to James throughout the year, sharing his drawings of guards and soldiers and his progress in school. The guards' patience and respect had given Diego confidence in social situations and helped him connect with others who shared his interests. James discovered that his actions had inspired changes beyond the military context. Tourism boards began developing programs to better accommodate visitors with disabilities. Hotels and restaurants near major attractions started training their staff to recognize and assist tourists who might need extra help. The ripple effect of one guard's decision to prioritize compassion over rigid protocol had created waves of positive change throughout London's tourism industry. The story continued to resonate internationally, with James receiving letters from military personnel around the world who shared their own stories of times when they had to choose between following orders and following their conscience. Many credited his example with helping them find ways to serve with both discipline and humanity. 3 years later, James was promoted to sergeant major and given responsibility for training new guards. His first lesson to recruits always focused on the true meaning of service, that following orders and showing compassion were not mutually exclusive, but rather two aspects of the same commitment to serving others with honor and dignity. The guard who had once stood as a silent symbol had become a living example of how tradition and progress could work together. His story became part of the official history of the Queen's Guard, taught to new recruits as an example of how individual initiative in service of others could enhance rather than diminish military excellence. James often reflected on that morning, when he had made the choice to step beyond the boundaries of protocol. What had begun as a simple act of kindness toward an elderly woman had grown into something much larger, a demonstration that true strength lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in knowing when humanity must take precedence. The guard who had broken protocol to help others had ultimately strengthened the very institution he served, proving that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the courage to do what is right, rather than simply what is expected.